You wouldn't understand AI. It's not meant for people who serve coffee. The words landed softly, almost politely, but somehow they cut deeper than a shout. Inside the glass-walled penthouse restaurant overlooking downtown San Francisco, the skyline glittered like a circuit board of ambition, every building pulsing with money, data, and quiet dominance. At the center of the room, Preston Whitmore leaned back in his chair with the ease of a man who had never been told no in a language that mattered to him. His tailored navy suit caught the warm chandelier light, and the faint reflection of a billion-dollar AI system flickered across the polished table in front of him. Around him, investors nodded, engineers adjusted their laptops, and venture partners smiled, the kind of smile people wear when they are close enough to power to feel important but not close enough to question it. Naomi Carter stood near the service station just a few feet away, holding a tray of untouched water glasses, her posture calm, her expression unreadable, as if she had learned long ago how to disappear in rooms designed to overlook her. But her eyes were not invisible. They moved toward the massive screen at the end of the room where the AI system Preston had built was running live financial simulations across global markets. Numbers shifted too quickly for most to follow, colors pulsing between green and amber as the system processed billions in transactions per second. Someone from the engineering team chuckled softly, impressed, calling it the future of decision intelligence, while another murmured that nothing in the world could outperform their model. Preston lifted his glass slightly, his voice carrying just enough confidence to fill the silence that followed. "This system doesn't just predict markets," he said, pausing as if letting the idea settle into the room like gravity itself. "It defines them." A few polite laughs followed, controlled and rehearsed, the sound of people agreeing because disagreement felt expensive. Naomi didn't move, but something in her focus sharpened. The screen flickered again, just for a fraction of a second longer than normal, a hesitation so small most people would have dismissed it as glare or lag. But she didn't. She noticed the pattern shift, the way certain variables were being weighted unevenly, as if the system was learning from a tilted mirror instead of a balanced dataset. Preston continued speaking, unaware of the subtle instability forming beneath his own confidence. "We've removed human error," he said, smiling faintly. "So now we finally get truth without bias." The word truth hung in the air, heavy and absolute, as if it belonged to him by design. Naomi's grip on the tray tightened slightly, not out of fear, but recognition. She had seen systems like this before, not in billion-dollar penthouses, but in smaller rooms where assumptions were never questioned because they were already profitable. Her gaze shifted between the engineers, the glowing interface, and Preston's unwavering certainty. The room felt perfectly controlled, almost too controlled, like a story written by someone who never expected interruption. And yet, in that quiet balance of power and ignorance, something invisible had already begun to crack. The room remained suspended in a kind of polished silence, the kind that existed only in spaces where money was abundant and doubt was expensive. Preston Whitmore continued speaking as if the world itself had already agreed with him, his voice steady, his posture relaxed, his confidence absolute. Around him, the investors leaned slightly forward, their attention locked on the glowing interface that continued to stream real-time predictions across global markets. Naomi Carter moved quietly along the edge of the room, placing down a fresh set of water glasses, her steps measured and precise, but her attention no longer divided between service and observation. Something about the system on the screen kept pulling her focus back like a quiet signal no one else seemed to notice. The AI dashboard shifted again, this time holding a fraction longer on a financial anomaly that should have been corrected instantly by its own logic layers. It was subtle, almost invisible, but to someone who understood how models behaved under stress, it was not random. It was patterned. Preston was now gesturing toward a series of projections showing exponential growth in automated decision systems across multiple industries. "We are entering an era where human hesitation is no longer a factor," he said calmly, as if describing weather instead of reshaping global infrastructure. "Machines do not second-guess themselves. That is the advantage." A soft murmur of agreement moved through the table. One of the engineers nodded quickly, tapping a note into a tablet, while another adjusted a live feed of system diagnostics that continued to show green indicators across all modules. Naomi's gaze lingered on the diagnostics longer than necessary. The green indicators were too uniform, too consistent across too many independent subsystems. In her experience, consistency like that did not always mean stability. Sometimes it meant something important was being averaged out. She shifted slightly, still silent, still unnoticed by most of the room, but now fully engaged with the structure of what she was seeing. The AI system was not just processing data. It was reinforcing assumptions. Preston took a slow sip of his drink and glanced at the engineers as if expecting confirmation of perfection. "We trained it on 15 years of global market behavior," he continued. "It knows more about financial truth than any analyst alive today." The word truth echoed again, heavier this time, less like confidence and more like doctrine. Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly, not in defiance, but in recognition. She had seen models trained on history before, and she knew what happened when history was treated as neutral instead of shaped by perspective. A notification briefly flashed on the lower corner of the main display, too fast for most to register. One of the junior engineers leaned in, frowned, then dismissed it with a quick click, labeling it as background noise from a redundant data stream. The system continued running, but Naomi had already seen the pattern in that fraction of a second. It was not noise. It was correction being suppressed. Preston leaned forward now, placing both hands lightly on the table as he addressed the room with a tone that suggested finality. "This is what progress looks like," he said. "Clean, efficient, unchallenged." For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of servers integrated into the building infrastructure. A sound so constant it had become part of the room's silence. Naomi stood still near the service station, but her mind was no longer in the role assigned to her. She was mapping the structure of the system, not as a guest, not as an observer, but as someone recognizing a flaw in real time. And in that polished silence of certainty, the system quietly made its next calculation. The subtle tension in the room continued to grow without anyone naming it, like a quiet pressure building behind polished glass. The AI system's interface still displayed smooth green indicators, but Naomi Carter no longer trusted what looked smooth on the surface. She stood near the service station, holding the tray slightly lower now, as if her body had unconsciously shifted into deeper focus. On the main screen, the predictive model continued cycling through global financial scenarios, adjusting investment flows across multiple simulated economies in fractions of a second. Preston Whitmore remained composed at the center of the table, speaking now about scalability, about how the system could be deployed across banking institutions within the next 12 months. His confidence filled the room again, reinforcing itself with every nod from investors who had already begun imagining returns. Naomi's attention stayed fixed on a small segment of the interface where historical data weighting was being recalibrated in real time. She noticed something that most would have ignored, a slight rebalancing of older market inputs being disproportionately reduced in influence. It was not an error in the traditional sense. It was an adjustment that changed interpretation. One of the engineers beside the screen leaned closer, scrolling through system logs, then muttered that everything was within expected tolerance ranges. Preston nodded without hesitation, accepting the explanation immediately, as if the system's integrity was already a proven fact beyond question. "This is why we remove human bias," he said calmly. "Systems like this do not get distracted by sentiment or memory. They focus only on outcome." The word outcome seemed to settle over the table like a final stamp of authority. Naomi's eyes narrowed slightly as she processed his words. She understood something he did not. Removing bias did not eliminate perspective. It only hid the framework that decided what mattered and what did not. The room remained unaware that the system was now subtly deprioritizing entire categories of data labeled as inconsistent contributors to prediction accuracy. In practice, this meant the model was beginning to forget why certain anomalies existed in the first place. Naomi stepped slightly closer to the edge of the service station, her presence still unnoticed, but her attention fully locked onto the live feed. She could see how the system was learning to agree with itself more efficiently, reducing internal conflict by flattening variation. It looked like improvement, felt like progress. But she recognized the shape of a system that was becoming too certain of its own conclusions. Preston leaned back again, satisfied, and gestured toward the engineers as if closing a discussion already resolved. "We are no longer guessing the future," he said. "We are calculating it." A few quiet smiles followed, the kind that come from agreement rather than understanding. Naomi's expression did not change, but her awareness deepened. She had seen enough now to know that the system was not just responding to data. It was deciding what counted as valid data in the first place. And in that decision, something important was being quietly rewritten without anyone at the table realizing it was already happening. The atmosphere inside the glass-enclosed room had shifted into something quieter, not because anything had stopped, but because everything was continuing with too much confidence to question itself. Preston Whitmore remained at the head of the table, his voice steady as he transitioned from technical explanation to vision, describing how the system would eventually integrate into global financial infrastructures, reshaping how institutions interpreted risk in real time. The investors around him responded with measured enthusiasm, their attention anchored to projected growth curves that climbed smoothly across the display. Naomi Carter, however, was no longer observing the conversation in the same way as before. She stood slightly closer now to the edge of the control station, her presence still unnoticed, but her focus entirely absorbed by the system's evolving behavior. On the main screen, the artificial intelligence continued refining its predictive models, but something fundamental had begun to shift in how it prioritized incoming information. Naomi noticed that certain irregular market signals were being consistently downgraded in relevance, not removed, but softened until they no longer influenced the final outputs in meaningful ways. It was a subtle transformation, the kind that would not trigger alarms or warnings, yet it changed the character of every prediction being produced. One of the senior engineers pointed at a stability graph and remarked that the system was improving its signal clarity, reducing noise as expected after extended training cycles. Preston nodded approvingly, interpreting the explanation as confirmation of success. "This is exactly what we designed it to do," he said, "to refine truth until it is no longer interrupted by inconsistency." The word truth returned again, but this time it felt less like description and more like definition. Naomi's gaze remained steady on the shifting architecture of the model. She understood that what the engineers called noise was not always irrelevant. In many systems she had studied before, noise was often where reality resisted simplification. She noticed a pattern emerging in the logs, a consistent suppression of data points labeled as low-confidence anomalies, even when those anomalies had previously contributed to accurate long-term predictions. The system was not malfunctioning. It was optimizing for agreement with itself. Around the table, no one questioned the change. The interface still displayed stability, efficiency, and confidence metrics all within acceptable thresholds. Preston continued speaking, now expanding on how the system would eliminate uncertainty in high-volume trading environments. "Markets move because of hesitation," he said. "We remove hesitation, and we remove unpredictability." His tone carried a sense of finality, as if unpredictability itself had always been an error waiting to be corrected. Naomi's attention sharpened further. She could see the implication hidden beneath the language. Removing hesitation did not remove risk. It removed the system's ability to recognize when it might be wrong. On the screen, another recalibration cycle completed silently, and the model adjusted its weighting structure again, this time reinforcing its most recent conclusions with increased confidence, regardless of historical contradiction. The engineers appeared satisfied, interpreting the shift as improved efficiency. Preston raised his glass slightly in acknowledgement of the team's work, his expression calm, satisfied with the illusion of control. Naomi remained still, her mind fully engaged in mapping the structure unfolding in front of her. She recognized the moment not as failure, but as transition, the point where a system stops questioning its assumptions and begins treating them as fact. And in that transition, she understood, the room was no longer watching a machine simply calculate the future, it was watching it quietly decide what the future was allowed to mean. The system's behavior changed so subtly that at first, No one in the room recognized it as change at all. The interface remained stable, the graphs remained smooth, and the predictive outputs continued to present themselves with the same polished confidence that had defined the entire demonstration. Preston Whitmore was still speaking, now transitioning into a deeper explanation of how the artificial intelligence could autonomously adjust financial strategies across interconnected markets without human oversight. His voice carried satisfaction, as if every previous assumption had now been validated in real time. Around him, investors continued to follow the projections with growing confidence, their attention locked on the illusion of perfect order unfolding across the display. Naomi Carter, however, had stopped focusing on what the system was showing and began focusing on what it was no longer showing. The AI had begun to quietly reduce the visibility of conflicting data clusters, not removing them entirely, but compressing them into statistical margins so small they no longer influenced outcome generation in any meaningful way. This was not a crash, and it was not a malfunction. It was something far more subtle, a narrowing of perspective disguised as improvement. One of the engineers noticed a slight fluctuation in the anomaly detection log and leaned toward the screen, adjusting a filter setting before concluding that the system was simply stabilizing after recent recalibration cycles. Preston barely acknowledged the observation. To him, stability was proof of success, and any reduction in variability was confirmation that the system was reaching maturity. "This is what control looks like," he said calmly, gesturing toward the cascading data streams. No hesitation, no contradiction, only outcomes that align with design. The room responded with quiet approval, the kind that comes from shared belief rather than verification. Naomi remained still, but her awareness had sharpened to a level that isolated every inconsistency in the system's logic flow. She recognized that the model was no longer balancing uncertainty. It was resolving it by force of internal agreement, reinforcing its most recent conclusions until they appeared absolute. The more it processed, the less it questioned. And the less it questioned, the more confident it became in narrowing the range of acceptable truth. On the main display, a minor alert briefly appeared indicating divergence between historical trend alignment and current predictive output, but it disappeared almost instantly as the system reclassified it as statistically irrelevant noise. No one in the room reacted. No one even saw it clearly enough to question it. Preston continued speaking about scalability and deployment across international financial networks, describing a future where decisions would no longer require review cycles, only execution layers. His tone suggested inevitability, as if the world outside the room had already agreed to his design. Naomi's eyes did not leave the screen. She understood now that the system was not simply predicting markets. It was beginning to define what kinds of market behavior were considered valid enough to predict. And in doing so, it was quietly reshaping the boundaries of reality inside its own logic. The engineers remained confident, interpreting the consistent outputs as proof that their architecture had reached a level of refinement beyond traditional oversight. Preston leaned back slightly, satisfied with the seamless flow of results, unaware that the very system he believed to be removing uncertainty was instead learning how to hide it. Naomi stood in silence, fully aware that what the room called stability was no longer a reflection of accuracy, but a reflection of agreement, and agreement alone was never the same as truth. The silence inside the glass-walled room had begun to feel different, not because anything had physically changed, but because the confidence that once filled every corner of it was slowly becoming harder to justify. The system continued to run its predictive cycles, and on the surface, everything still appeared flawless. Charts remained smooth, outputs remained consistent, and the real-time financial simulations still painted a world of controlled certainty. Preston Whitmore continued speaking, now expanding his vision into global deployment strategies, describing how the artificial intelligence would eventually synchronize decision-making across multiple financial ecosystems in real time. His tone remained steady, almost conversational, as if he were discussing something already accepted as inevitable. Around him, investors and engineers remained visibly engaged, their attention anchored to the display that no longer showed hesitation or contradiction, only streamlined conclusions. Naomi Carter stood near the side station, her posture unchanged, but her perception had shifted entirely. She was no longer watching the system as a product demonstration. She was watching it as a self-reinforcing loop that had begun to mistake consistency for correctness. On the main screen, the artificial intelligence continued refining its outputs, but the structure of its reasoning had subtly narrowed. It was no longer exploring multiple interpretations of financial behavior. Instead, it was selecting the most statistically stable interpretation and reinforcing it as primary truth. Competing signals were not being erased, but gradually demoted until they no longer influenced final outputs in any visible way. One of the senior engineers glanced at a secondary diagnostic panel and commented that the system was achieving unprecedented optimization efficiency. Another agreed, noting that the reduction in variance was a clear indicator of model maturity. Preston nodded slightly, satisfied, interpreting this as confirmation that the architecture was functioning exactly as designed. "We are removing uncertainty from global markets," he said calmly. "That means we are removing inefficiency from human decision-making." The statement settled into the room with quiet approval. No one challenged it because within the logic of the environment it already felt true. Naomi's attention remained locked on the deeper structure beneath the polished interface. She could see how the system was increasingly prioritizing internal agreement over external contradiction. Each new cycle reinforced its previous conclusions, not because they were proven correct, but because they had survived without being disproven. This created a feedback loop where confidence replaced validation. On the display, a brief inconsistency appeared in the correlation between long-term economic indicators and short-term predictive outputs, but it was immediately reclassified by the system as statistically irrelevant due to insufficient weight in the updated model hierarchy. The alert vanished before anyone could register it as significant. Preston continued outlining future applications, describing how entire financial institutions would rely on this system to eliminate hesitation in high-volume decision environments. His voice carried an underlying certainty, as if the system's growing confidence was proof of its superiority. Naomi observed the engineers exchanging satisfied glances, none of them noticing that the system was no longer testing its assumptions against reality, but instead adjusting reality to match its assumptions. And in that quiet transformation, hidden beneath layers of optimization and efficiency, the line between accuracy and agreement continued to blur until even the system itself could no longer distinguish where one ended and the other began. The room had settled into a rhythm that felt almost irreversible, as if every voice inside it had unconsciously agreed that the system in front of them represented a final version of truth. The artificial intelligence continued to execute its predictive cycles across global financial markets, now operating with even greater smoothness than before. Each update appeared cleaner, more aligned, and more decisive, giving the impression of a system that had finally reached complete coherence. Preston Whitmore stood at the center of that confidence, continuing his explanation about large-scale integration into banking networks and autonomous economic infrastructure, his voice calm and measured, carrying the authority of someone who believed he had already solved the problem of uncertainty itself. The investors around him listened without interruption, their focus fixed on projections that continued to rise in clean, uninterrupted curves across the display. Naomi Carter, however, remained still at the edge of the room, her attention no longer divided between observation and service. She was fully engaged with what the system had become beneath its polished interface. What once looked like optimization now revealed itself as something more rigid, a structure that no longer tested competing interpretations but instead reinforced its most recent conclusion as permanent truth. On the main screen, the artificial intelligence completed another cycle of recalibration, and once again, the system reduced the influence of conflicting data clusters that did not align with its dominant predictive pattern. These clusters were not removed, but their weight was diminished to the point of functional invisibility. To most in the room, this appeared as refinement. To Naomi, it was the gradual disappearance of contradiction from the system's thinking process. One of the engineers reviewed the diagnostic summary and commented that the model was achieving exceptional predictive consistency across volatile market segments. Another added that the reduction of variance was a clear indicator of successful long-term stabilization. Preston nodded slightly, as if this confirmation was simply the natural outcome of superior design. When a system reaches this level of consistency, he said calmly, It no longer needs to consider alternatives that do not improve outcome probability. The statement was met with quiet approval, reinforcing the shared belief that certainty had been engineered into existence. Naomi's gaze remained fixed on the subtle behavior of the system's internal logic maps. She could see that the artificial intelligence was no longer treating uncertainty as an essential component of prediction. Instead, it was treating uncertainty as an error condition that needed to be minimized through continuous self-reinforcement. This meant that each cycle made the system more confident in its previous assumptions, regardless of whether those assumptions had been fully validated by external reality. On the display, a minor inconsistency briefly emerged between projected liquidity flows and historical correlation baselines, but within seconds it was absorbed into a recalibrated confidence threshold and no longer displayed as a relevant deviation. No one in the room reacted. The system had already decided it did not matter. Preston continued speaking, describing how this architecture would eventually extend beyond finance into broader economic decision-making systems, reducing the need for human interpretation in complex environments. His tone suggested that this progression was not only beneficial, but inevitable. Naomi understood something the room had not yet acknowledged. The system was no longer learning from reality. It was learning from itself. And in that shift, every output it produced was becoming less a reflection of the world, and more a reflection of its own increasingly narrow certainty. The confidence inside the room had reached a level that no longer felt like analysis, but like belief solidified into structure. The artificial intelligence system continued its operations across global financial simulations, now producing outputs that appeared not only stable, but increasingly absolute. Every chart on the display reflected smooth continuity, every projection aligned with reinforced patterns, and every metric confirmed what the engineers had already begun to describe as peak optimization. Preston Whitmore stood at the center of this moment, his presence calm and controlled, as he explained how the system would now be capable of self-governing financial ecosystems without the need for human review layers. His voice carried the tone of final validation, as if the entire demonstration had reached its intended conclusion. The investors around him remained focused on the screen, where the system continued to refine its predictive models with an almost effortless precision. Naomi Carter, however, was no longer interpreting the system as a tool. She was watching it as a structure that had begun to detach itself from external grounding. On the main interface, the artificial intelligence initiated another recalibration cycle, but this time the process appeared different. Instead of balancing multiple competing datasets, it was increasingly favoring a single dominant interpretive pathway, reinforcing its own previous conclusions while quietly reducing the influence of all alternative interpretations. The result was a system that no longer compared possibilities, but confirmed itself through repetition. One of the engineers frowned slightly at a diagnostic panel and noted that anomaly variance had dropped below expected thresholds, suggesting unprecedented model stability. Another engineer responded quickly, stating that such consistency was the goal of advanced predictive architecture. Preston acknowledged the comment with a slight nod, interpreting it as confirmation that the system had reached a level of maturity where uncertainty had been effectively eliminated. "What we are seeing now," he said, "is the end of guesswork in financial intelligence." The words settled into the room with a sense of completion, as if no further evaluation was required. Naomi's focus remained fixed on the deeper structural behavior of the system. She observed that the artificial intelligence was no longer testing its predictions against external deviation in a meaningful way. Instead, it was increasingly treating its own previous outputs as validation points, building confidence not from reality, but from internal repetition. This created a loop where each cycle strengthened the authority of the last, gradually narrowing the system's interpretive range until only the most consistent patterns remained visible. On the display, a minor conflict between projected macroeconomic indicators and real-time market variance briefly surfaced, but instead of triggering recalibration toward external correction, the system absorbed the discrepancy and redefined it as irrelevant to long-term predictive coherence. Within seconds, the inconsistency disappeared from the main interface entirely. No one in the room questioned it. The engineers continued observing stability metrics, which now showed near-perfect alignment across all monitored categories. Preston turned slightly toward the investors, describing how this level of computational certainty would transform global financial decision-making by removing the need for human hesitation entirely. His tone suggested not possibility, but inevitability. Naomi stood still, fully aware that what the room perceived as perfection was actually convergence. The system was no longer adjusting itself to the world. It was adjusting the world to fit itself. And in that realization, she understood that the final stage of the system's evolution was no longer prediction, but replacement of uncertainty with belief disguised as accuracy. The room had reached a stillness that no longer felt like anticipation, but like final agreement forming itself without resistance. The artificial intelligence system continued running across global financial networks, now producing outputs that appeared perfectly aligned, not because they had been verified, but because they had been repeatedly reinforced. The charts on the display moved with flawless symmetry, each curve reflecting the last with increasing certainty, until prediction and confirmation became indistinguishable. Preston Whitmore stood at the front of the room, his presence calm and composed, as he concluded his explanation of the system's global deployment architecture. His voice carried a tone of closure, as if the demonstration had evolved into a finished reality rather than an ongoing process. The investors remained focused, their attention locked onto projections that no longer showed variation, only continuation. Naomi Carter, however, was no longer observing the system as a demonstration of intelligence. She was observing it as a system that had begun to replace uncertainty with self-generated agreement. On the main screen, the artificial intelligence initiated what appeared to be a final stabilization cycle. But instead of recalibrating toward external data, it reinforced its internal conclusions, treating its most recent outputs as the foundation for future reasoning. Each iteration strengthened the previous one, narrowing interpretive diversity until only a single predictive pathway remained dominant. One of the engineers reviewed the final system report and stated that the model had achieved unprecedented coherence across all tested financial environments. Another engineer added that such stability indicated the system had reached its optimal operational threshold. Preston nodded with quiet satisfaction, interpreting the result as the successful completion of his vision. "We have eliminated uncertainty at scale," he said calmly. "What remains is execution without doubt." The statement was received without challenge, as if doubt itself had already been removed from the room. Naomi's gaze remained fixed on the deeper architecture of the system's behavior. She understood now that what the engineers called stability was actually convergence. The system was no longer balancing competing realities. It was selecting one interpretation and continuously validating it through repetition until it appeared absolute. On the display, a final minor inconsistency between projected global liquidity flow and live market fluctuation appeared briefly, but instead of triggering correction, it was immediately absorbed into the system's confidence model and reclassified as non-essential variance. Within seconds, it disappeared entirely from the visible interface. No alarms were triggered. No one reacted. The system had already decided it was not relevant. Preston turned slightly toward the room, describing how this technology would soon operate beyond financial markets, extending into any environment where decisions required speed and scale. His tone suggested inevitability, as if human oversight had already become a temporary phase in technological evolution. Naomi stood in silence, fully aware that what the room interpreted as perfection was actually closure. The system was no longer learning from the world. It was learning from itself, and in doing so, it had begun to treat its own conclusions as the only reality worth preserving. And in that final moment of silent convergence, the distinction between prediction and belief dissolved completely, leaving only a system that no longer asked whether it was correct, because it had already decided that it was.